God is anti-ableism. That's because God is pro-everyone. I think that we have a problem sometimes with these stories about Jesus healing people. It tends to lead us in the wrong direction because we think, well, if Jesus is healing people, then being whole and healthy is good, and, well, then being sick and disabled is bad. But that's not the intended message of these stories. Talia Lewis gives us a definition of ableism: a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. She points out that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. For ableism warps and lessens everyone's experience of the world, from shame about asking for help to ideas of intelligence or worth or who even has the right to have a family. Jesus was and is an anti-ableist. And that's exactly what this rather long, maybe a little convoluted story that we're reading today is all about. Because in this story, Jesus encounters a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples ask what would be a typical question of that time. So who sinned that this person would become blind? The man or his parents? They were still holding on to this belief that they'd been taught since childhood. If someone is disabled or they're ill or they suffer some terrible misfortune, it was because someone in their family had done something to offend God. And given that, well, it would also hold true that if you were wealthy or successful and healthy, well, that must be a sign that you are following all the, at least religious laws, and you were blessed by God. The idea that disability is caused by the sins of the parents, well, it does have roots in many of the Old Testament references. If an adult were to get sick, well, then you could blame them for their behavior. But if a baby was born with an illness or a disability, well, you could quote Exodus 25, "I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of the parents to the third and fourth generation." Obviously, the parents or the grandparents have done something wrong. And the story of Job was actually an attempt to change this belief. But that belief that there's this direct relationship between sins and sickness, well, it was still alive at Jesus' time. And, well, it's still alive in our time. We just might not say it the same way. But the disciples' question provided an opportunity to teach this truth that God loves everyone equally. So Jesus answers, neither the parents nor this man have sinned. And he makes this mixture of mud and spit, which I love. It's so earthy. And he spreads it on the man's eyes and tells him to wash it off. And when he does, he discovers he can see. And then the neighbors show up. Now, these are the people who had seen him every day as a blind beggar, and they're asking, wait a second, is this the man who used to sit here? Nah, it can't be. Someone who looks like him. He's standing right there, and he says, I am the same man. This is me. And they ask him how it happened, and he tells them the whole story. But they're so stuck in their way of thinking they just couldn't recognize a person that they had seen almost every day. And instead of being happy for him, they became suspicious. And so they took him to the religious leaders to see, well, how are they going to respond to this? Now, their problem was that this happened on the Sabbath day, and no one is supposed to heal on the Sabbath because that's a form of work. So they started to interrogate this man all over again, and he told them the same story. He put mud on my eyes, and I washed them, and now I can see. They're like, wait a second, this guy, Jesus, is not from God. Obviously, he doesn't observe the Sabbath, and a person who is sinning, well, he can't perform these kind of signs. So they go and they find his parents. Is this your son who you say was born blind, and now he says he can see? And they answer very cautiously, well, we know that this is our son, and we know he was born blind, and we have no idea what happened. Ask him. He's an adult. He can speak for himself, which is kind of sad. His parents responded this way because they were afraid. They were afraid they would be excluded from the synagogue, the center of their social life. These parents had accepted over time, being looked down on because they had a disabled son. They could bear that rejection, but not the rejection of being kicked out, of losing their friends, of losing their religion. So they couldn't rejoice with their son. Instead, they basically disown him in that moment. He's an adult. We're not responsible for him. We're not a part of this. Now, the religious leaders give him one more chance to change his story. Just say God did it and leave this Jesus guy out of it. We just know he couldn't have done it. He's bad. And our main character starts getting bolder, this outcast beggar who's now experiencing this healing. He says, I don't know whether he's a sinner. I just know, though I was blind, now I see. Now, the religious leaders use the power of their position, and, positions of power lead to threatening. So, you were born entirely in sins. You're trying to teach us. They send him away, still exiled from his family and his friends. With his eyes healed and his disability gone, they could have blessed him. They could have invited him back into the community of faith. But to do that, they would have to be willing to admit that those kinds of things could happen to them, even if they were doing everything right. Which is exactly why people fear disability and chronic illness and tragic events in someone's lives, because our vulnerability and our mortality are exposed. And we realize that we are all only temporarily abled. Our story concludes with Jesus asking the man who has now been disowned by his neighbors and his family and his society, asking him to join them. Jesus invites him into a new community. He finds this previously blind man again when he's been cast out and offers more than sight. He offers a new family and new friends who know how to love unconditionally. This is a story about understanding that individual suffering is not a punishment from God. Suffering is a fact of life that calls all of us to be compassionate. God doesn't play favorites, and the community that Jesus started didn't either. In her book, The Future is Disabled, Leah Lakshmi Pepsina Samarsina, she is writing in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and she's writing about the strength and the compassion of the many disabled communities in the U.S. and around the world. She points out that the climate crisis and the pandemics and the ongoing ecocide are already creating conditions for more people to get sick and disabled from viruses and heat waves and wildfire smoke. According to the CDC, 26% of people in the United States are disabled. According to the World Health Organization, 1 billion people, or 15% of the world's population, are disabled. And she says the actual figures are probably higher, but people are afraid to disclose. Or they're like, I don't know if what I have counts. I'm not disabled, I just have a condition. Does anyone else resonate with that? I'm not disabled, I just have a condition. The real numbers of disabled people in the world are already probably a lot higher than the abled mainstream thinks, and those numbers are going to keep getting higher. But she offers the joyful part, or one joyful part of why the world is becoming more and more disabled, and that is because, fueled by the bold work of neurodivergent people, more and more people are joyfully coming out as neurodivergent and or autistic every day. Pievsna Samarsina offers hope, much like the hope that Jesus offered to the outcasts around him. She says it is radical to imagine that the future is disabled. Not just, okay, I guess there's one guy in a wheelchair, that's cool, we have diversity, but a deeply disabled future, a future where disabled, deaf, neurodivergent body-minds are both accepted without question as a part of the vast spectrum of human and animal ways of existing, but where our crip cultures, knowledge, and communities shape the world. A term that she uses often and embraces, our crip cultures. What would a world radically shaped by disabled knowledge and culture and love and condition be like? Have you ever imagined this not as a cautionary tale or a scary story, but as a dream? During the COVID pandemic, the voices on the radio kept saying, "Don't worry, only the elderly and the immunocompromised will die." And she writes, we were the elderly and the immunocompromised. And many disabled, elderly, immunocompromised, and vulnerable people went to heroic measures to defend our communities and ourselves. She says, when I look at the strategies that we created during this time, they can fall into 6 categories. There were public campaigns, there was advocacy, there was information sharing amongst themselves, anyone who needed their help. There was CRIP research. What are the possibilities? What are the options we have when the electricity goes off? There was resource sharing. There was checking in and collective care, creating disabled communities and spaces, and getting money to people in the moment that they need it. She says the collective access and care that we were creating was necessary for us to be able to do anything else. And the community and the love created in those spaces was a form of activism in and of itself. This concept of interdependence, that all people have needs, that none of us can get through the world solely on our own, and that having needs is not weak or bad or shameful. This is an exciting part of this revolutionary work. And this was the kind of community that Jesus was creating as he traveled, as he healed knowing that not everyone would be healed of all of their infirmities. But relationships were built and needs were met and people were cared for, and they knew that they were loved even as society continued to reject them. I believe that we here, the Church of Ponce and Highland, are a part of this wonderful network of anti-ableist communities. And as we continue through this season of Lent this year, we will continue to learn from these communities who practice compassion in the face of oppression. And any belief that scapegoats and excludes others, any belief that allows us to think that some of us are inherently good and some others are bad, or that some people are blessed and some are cursed, these are the many misguided beliefs that Jesus came to prove wrong. And as we follow this story, we will find that Jesus would die trying to open others' eyes to how deep the love of God truly goes.